These sandwiches didn't come from restaurants. They came from mothers who could stretch a single can of tuna across 3 days, from dads who slapped meatloaf between bread before dawn. They were humble, forgotten, and often strange, but they held America together, one bite at a time. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches. Sometimes dinner was 2 slices of white bread and whatever you could smear between them. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches weren't glamorous, but they were fast, cheap, and just sweet enough to feel like you weren't scraping rock bottom. You spread a thick layer of peanut butter across the bread, then poured a ribbon of syrup over the top. Caro, maple, or homemade cane syrup, if you were lucky. Fold it together, and you had a sticky, salty sweet mess that hit the spot like nothing else. It was the kind of meal that didn't need heat, prep, or even a plate. You could eat it standing up, walking to work, or lying in bed after a long day. It filled your belly, gave you just enough sugar to forget what else was missing, and went down easy. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches weren't about health or balance. They were about getting through, about feeding yourself with what was left in the pantry when everything else was gone. And somehow, they still tasted good enough to remember. Apple cider vinegar stew. This was depression food, sour, simple, and stronger than it looked. Apple cider vinegar stew started with whatever root vegetables you had: potatoes, onions, carrots. You peeled what needed peeling, chopped it all coarse, and threw it into a pot with water and a splash of cider vinegar. The vinegar cut through everything, brought brightness to the broth, and made up for the absence of meat. Sometimes there was a scrap of bacon or salt pork. Sometimes just a bay leaf or a clove of garlic. Most of the time it was the vegetables, the vinegar, and a long boil that made it something worth eating. You served it hot, ladled into bowls, and eaten with a spoon scraped across the bottom. It wasn't rich, but it was honest. It woke up your tongue, warmed your stomach, and reminded you that a little bite could be a blessing. Boiled potatoes with canned green beans. You started with the potatoes, peeled or not depending on time and preference. Boiled them in salted water until they were soft enough to mash with a fork but not falling apart. Then you dumped in a can of green beans, liquid and all, and let everything simmer together for a few minutes. The beans took on the starch of the potatoes. The potatoes took on the salt of the beans. Some folks drained it and served it with butter. Others left it as is, watery and plain, and ladled it out into bowls. It was a no-fuss meal, warm and gentle on the stomach, something to serve the kids when the money had run dry, but dinner still had to happen. It didn't look like much, and it wasn't meant to, but it got the job done. Hot food, fast, and enough for everyone to get seconds. Liver spread on crackers. In houses where nothing got wasted, even the scraps of liver were given new life. Liver spread on crackers was poor man's pâté, rough, strong tasting, but filling enough to make a meal when there wasn't much else around. You started by boiling or frying up the liver, beef, chicken, pork, whatever you could find cheap, until it was cooked through and crumbly. Then you mashed it into a coarse paste with whatever fat you had lying around, bacon drippings, lard, or butter if you were lucky, salt, pepper, and maybe a pinch of onion powder or garlic made it just palatable enough. You spread it thick onto saltines or old biscuits, stacking them up until the liver filled the gaps between the cracks. It was salty, earthy, and bold, something you ate not because it was delicate, but because it was heavy and stuck with you. Each bite carried the iron tang of survival, a flavor that didn't apologize for its rough edges. You could feed 3 kids and 2 tired adults on a plate of liver spread and crackers. And in those kitchens, that meant success. It was food that came from necessity, dressed up just enough to trick the mind into calling it a meal. Cabbage and potato soup. You didn't need much to make cabbage and potato soup. Just a pot, a flame, and the will to keep moving. You peeled and chopped the potatoes, rough and quick. Then came the cabbage, shredded by hand or knife into thick, wrinkled strips. You dropped everything into a big pot of salted water or thin broth. Let it boil until the cabbage softened and the potatoes cracked open just enough to cloud the liquid. Onion, if you had it. A clove of garlic, if you were lucky. But the heart of it was always the same. A cheap, honest meal that filled a bowl and stuck to your ribs. Served with stale bread or nothing at all, cabbage and potato soup reminded you that the line between survival and comfort was thinner than people think. It didn't win awards. It didn't need seasoning secrets. It just needed to be hot, heavy, and ready by the time the sun went down. Fried apples and biscuits. You peeled and sliced the apples thin, tossed them in a skillet with butter, or bacon grease if that's all you had, and sprinkled sugar over the top like a memory. They fried down slow, turning golden and soft, the sugar bubbling into syrup, and the fruit collapsing into sweet, sticky ribbons. Meanwhile, you baked up a batch of biscuits from scratch. Just flour, lard, baking powder, and water if that was all the pantry allowed. They came out uneven, but hot, split down the middle, and steaming. You spooned the fried apples right on top. Let the syrup soak in. Ate it with your hands or a fork, depending on how tired the day had made you. It wasn't breakfast. It wasn't dessert. It was just food, sweet, simple, and so good it almost made you forget how little was in the icebox. Fried apples and biscuits reminded you that comfort didn't need cost. It needed heat, time, and a little sugar. Rice and butter with cinnamon sugar. Sometimes dinner came in the form of a dessert that didn't know it was a dessert. You boiled rice till it was soft and tender, drained it, and while it was still hot, stirred in a big slab of butter until every grain gleamed. Then came the cinnamon and sugar, shaken from old tins, sprinkled with a heavy hand, until the air smelled sweet enough to trick your body into thinking you were celebrating something. You didn't plate it fancy. You didn't bake it. You scooped it into bowls and ate it steaming hot, the sugar melting into syrupy puddles at the bottom. Rice and butter with cinnamon sugar wasn't filling like meat and potatoes. It didn't stick like beans and bread, but it gave you a sense of comfort that sometimes mattered more. It warmed you from the inside out, made you sit a little taller at the dinner table, even if the pantry behind you was nearly bare. It wasn't about being full. It was about remembering what a little sweetness could do to a tired heart. Mashed potato sandwich. Leftovers never went to waste, not when mouths outnumbered dollars. After supper, the cold, mashed potatoes went back into the icebox. By noon the next day, they became the core of a mashed potato sandwich. Thick slabs of bread cradled a scoop of cold, salted mashed spuds, sometimes smeared with mustard or topped with an onion slice. It was starchy, heavy, and oddly comforting. Some days, a crust of gravy clung to the potato and made it feel like more than scraps. This was a lunchbox favorite for mill workers, coal miners, and school kids alike. Easy to make, cheap to pack, and dense with enough carbs to keep the belly full. It wasn't elegant, but it did the job. Some toasting the bread gave it contrast. Others preferred it soft. It often showed up on Mondays, when Sunday's roast was long gone, but the potatoes lived on. The sandwich was a quiet reminder that in hard times, food was circular. Nothing ended. It just changed shape. Leftovers were sacred. And sandwiches like these were a badge of resourcefulness. Peanut butter and pickle sandwich. This wasn't a dare. It was a Depression-era miracle that stuck around through sheer audacity. Spread salty peanut butter on soft white bread, then top it with a few slices of dill pickle. That's it. The sharp vinegar of the pickle cut through the dry stickiness of the peanut butter like lightning. For some, it was a flavor revolution. For others, an act of desperation. Either way, it filled a lunchbox, silenced a growling stomach, and left a memory that outlasted hunger. This odd pairing was often born from leftovers, the last bit of peanut butter clinging to the jar, and a few pickles floating lonely in brine. The sandwich traveled in wax paper to schoolyards and rail cars. It didn't need refrigeration, didn't spoil fast, and made a little go a long way. Some added mustard for an extra jolt. Some swore by sweet pickles instead of dill, but the essence was the same. Salty, sour, sticky, survival. It was a sandwich that shouldn't work, but did, just like the people who ate it. Mock chicken legs, city chicken. It looked like chicken. It tasted close, but there wasn't a feather in sight. Mock chicken legs, better known in factory towns as city chicken, were skewers of pork or veal dressed up to look like something more expensive. You took small cubes of cheap meat, threaded them tight onto wooden skewers, and breaded them like drumsticks. Then you pan-fried them until golden and crisp, finishing in the oven if you had the time. They came out hot, crunchy on the outside, juicy on the inside, and just familiar enough to fool you into thinking you were eating something finer. Served with mashed potatoes, gravy, canned peas, or just a hunk of white bread, city chicken turned a few scraps of meat into a meal that felt special, even when it wasn't. It wasn't about pretending. It was about working with what you had and making it taste like something worth sitting down for. That was the genius behind poor man's cooking. Sweet potato and onion hash. You peeled sweet potatoes by hand, rough and quick, the skins curling off onto the counter. Diced them into rough cubes. Did the same with a couple onions, sharp, tear-inducing, but necessary. Into a heavy skillet they went, tossed into bacon grease or lard if you had it, into plain oil if you didn't. The sweet potatoes sizzled against the heat, their sugars caramelizing at the edges, while the onions melted into soft, golden strings. You stirred with a wooden spoon, scraping up the bits that stuck to the pan, smelling the sharpness of the onion, mixing with the earthiness of the potatoes. Salt and pepper came next, heavy shakes from old tin shakers. There wasn't any meat on the plate most nights, but nobody complained. Sweet potato and onion hash filled the kitchen with a heavy, rich smell, and it sat in your stomach like a promise that maybe tomorrow wouldn't be so lean. You piled it onto chipped plates, ate it hot, and scraped up every bit. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted, just potatoes, onions, and enough hope fried into every bite to carry you through. Macaroni and milk. Macaroni and milk was about as bare-boned as comfort food came. You boiled macaroni until soft, drained it, and poured milk over it, just enough to keep it from feeling dry, just enough to feel like something warm and complete. A bit of butter, if you had it, a pinch of salt. Some people added pepper, some added sugar. Most did whatever their grandmother taught them to do. You didn't bake it. You didn't dress it up. You just stirred it and served it. It came to the table hot and bland, but there was something soothing in that. It didn't ask anything of you but a spoon and an appetite. Macaroni and milk was what you made when groceries were low and spirits were lower. It was soft, cheap, and filling, a blank page you could survive on. And when you had more again, you remembered how this little bowl had carried you through the worst of it. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches, properly expanded. When the meat was gone and payday was still too far away, you reached for the egg carton and the vinegar bottle. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches weren't fancy, but they were fast, cheap, and just good enough to feel like real food. You boiled the eggs hard, no runny yolks, no careful timing. Just a full rolling boil until they were chalky and firm. Peeled them quick, crushed them rough with a fork, and stirred in a heavy splash of vinegar to wake them up. The vinegar made the eggs sing, sharp and clean, cutting through the heavy yolk like a hot knife. You pile the mixture onto slices of bread, sometimes adding a pinch of salt, maybe a crack of pepper if the jar wasn't empty. The bread soaked up the vinegar, softening just enough to hold everything together. It wasn't elegant, but it was rich with flavor and heavy enough to quiet a stomach gnawing from too many lean nights. Hard-boiled egg and vinegar sandwiches didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. They were sour, strong, and stubborn as the people who made them. And every bite carried a promise. You were still standing, and you were still eating. Boiled potatoes with butter and onions. If you had potatoes, you had dinner. Boil them whole or chopped, skins on or off, whatever time and energy allowed. Melt butter in a pan. Fry up a chopped onion until it went soft and golden. Drain the potatoes, throw them in, smash them gently with a fork, and let them soak up everything. Some folks added salt, others added pepper. A few tossed in whatever herbs were growing wild out back. Served hot, it was a one-pan meal that smelled like home and tasted like you were doing okay, even when the cupboards told a different story. Cornmeal fried fish, caught locally. When you couldn't afford the butcher, you went to the river. Bluegill, catfish, perch. Whatever bit the line that day went into the skillet. You cleaned them quick, dusted them in seasoned cornmeal, and dropped them into a cast-iron pan full of hot oil. They fried fast, crispy on the outside, flaky inside. Served with hush puppies or a scoop of grits, it was a meal born from the water and a little grit. Cornmeal fried fish didn't need sauce. It needed time, a sharp knife, and enough oil to do the job right. When dinner hit the table, it didn't last long. Fried cabbage with bacon grease. A head of cabbage didn't look like much sitting on the counter, but slice it up, throw it in a skillet, slicked with bacon grease, and suddenly it became a dinner that could carry a family. The trick was in the sizzle. You wanted the heat high, the pan loud, and the cabbage brown just enough to turn sweet at the edges. The bacon grease did more than fry. It soaked in, filling every bite with the ghost of meat long gone. Sometimes you added a sliced onion, sometimes a pinch of sugar, but most of the time it was just salt, pepper, and whatever willpower you had left that day. Piled high on a plate beside a heel of bread, fried cabbage was proof that simplicity didn't mean weakness. It meant you knew how to take what you had and make it taste like something worth remembering. Mashed rutabagas with bacon grease. Rutabagas weren't glamorous. They were hard, knobby, bitter if you didn't cook them right. But when boiled until soft and mashed with a heavy spoonful of bacon grease, they became something earthy, smoky, and surprisingly filling. You peeled them with a paring knife, chopped them into rough cubes, and boiled them until they yielded to the fork. Then came the mashing, bare hands, strong wrists, and just enough bacon fat to smooth it all out. Salt, pepper, maybe a bit of chopped onion. That was it. You served them warm, heavy, and humble. No side dishes. Just a plate of mashed rutabaga, steaming and honest. It was food from the ground, flavored by scraps, carried by effort, and when you ate it, you remembered the old folks who taught you how to cook it, because they had no other choice. oatmeal and bacon. Fat. There were nights when you didn't have sugar. No brown sugar, no syrup, no honey. Just a sack of oats and the old coffee tin of saved bacon grease by the stove. You boiled water, poured in the oats, and stirred until they thickened into something heavy and plain. Then you scooped in a spoonful of bacon fat, greasy, smoky, salted from breakfasts long gone, and stirred until the whole pot took on the flavor of better days. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't delicate, it was salty, hearty, and heavy enough to anchor a man to the ground through another freezing morning. You didn't dress it up. You ate it straight, bowl in one hand, spoon in the other, standing at the kitchen counter if the table was already piled with unpaid bills. Oatmeal with bacon fat wasn't a meal you made because you liked it. It was the meal you made because it stayed in your gut like armor. It was heavy and plain and real, and it kept you going when there wasn't much else to hold you up. Tomato sandwich. When the tomatoes were ripe and falling off the vine faster than they could be canned, the tomato sandwich reigned supreme. Thick, juicy slices of homegrown tomato, deep red and bursting with flavor, were laid across soft bread smeared with mayonnaise or butter. Salt and pepper crowned the top. That was it. It didn't pretend to be anything fancy. But in the heat of a southern summer, with sweat dripping and sunburn setting in, nothing tasted more alive. The tomato sandwich was seasonal salvation. It was the joy of growing your own food, the pride of a backyard garden feeding a family of 7. Kids came in from chores with sunburnt arms and dirt under their nails, and this was what waited on the table. Soggy bread, red juice running down fingers, the tang of salt and acid on the tongue. It was messy and marvelous. When meat was too expensive and store trips were rare, this sandwich filled the gap. It was cheap, abundant, and for a brief moment in August, tasted like luxury. People remembered it long after they could afford more. Noodle and ketchup skillet. This wasn't spaghetti. This was survival. You boiled a handful of dry noodles, elbows, egg noodles, whatever was cheapest, and when they were soft, you drained them and dumped them back into the skillet. Then came the ketchup, not sauce, ketchup. Squeezed straight from the bottle, stirred in until the noodles turned red and slippery. A pinch of salt, maybe a little pepper. Some folks added chopped onion, if they had it, or a cube of butter to smooth it out. You let it sizzle for a minute, the ketchup caramelizing just enough to smell like something more than what it was. It hit the plate hot, sweet, and tangy. It wasn't trying to taste like Italian food. It wasn't trying to taste like anything but enough. Noodle and ketchup skillet didn't pretend. It filled the belly and stretched the budget. And for families who didn't have meat or cheese or even a can of tomato sauce, it got the job done. Sloppy Joe stretch, heavy sauce, little meat. You didn't need much beef to make a sloppy Joe, just enough to color the sauce. That was the stretch. Start with a half-pound of ground beef, browned and broken, fine in the skillet. Then came the bulk, ketchup, mustard, maybe a little vinegar or brown sugar, onions if you had them, oats, or breadcrumbs if you wanted to pad it out further. The sauce simmered until it thickened, coating every crumb of meat until it looked like more than it was. Piled high on soft white bread, or whatever rolls you could get your hands on, it oozed out the sides and made a mess that said, "Real food is happening here." Kids loved it. Adults leaned back full. And nobody asked how much meat was actually in there, because dinner was hot, sloppy, and good enough to forget the math. Cornmeal gravy over biscuits. Gravy didn't need drippings. It didn't need sausage. Sometimes it didn't even need meat at all. It needed cornmeal, water, and stubbornness. You browned a handful of cornmeal in a hot skillet, stirring it steady, letting it go just dark enough to smell like roasted corn. Then you poured in water, slow, careful, and kept stirring until it thickened into something closer to porridge than gravy. Salt, pepper, maybe a crack of cayenne if you were lucky enough to have a spice tin tucked away. You split open rough-made biscuits, flour, water, and lard slapped together and baked quick, and poured the cornmeal gravy over the top, hot and heavy. It wasn't silky, it wasn't pretty. It was thick, hearty, and stuck to your ribs like the memory of every hard season you'd lived through. Cornmeal gravy over biscuits wasn't something you served to company. It was something you served to family, to tired hands, to empty pockets. And for all its plainness, it filled you with a warmth that no fancy sauce ever could. Canned sardines on crackers. You didn't need a stove to make this meal, just a can opener, a stack of saltines, and an empty stomach. Canned sardines on crackers were the kind of dinner you could fix with one hand while the other rubbed the exhaustion out of your face. You peeled back the lid on the tiny tin, briny fish packed tight in oil or mustard sauce, and spooned them straight onto the crackers, one fillet at a time. Some people mashed them. Some ate them whole. Either way, they brought salt, fat, and protein to a plate that didn't have much else. If you had a slice of onion, you added it. If you had a splash of hot sauce, you drizzled. But most nights it was just fish, crackers, and quiet chewing. It wasn't pretty, but it didn't need to be. Sardines didn't apologize for their smell or their shine. They just fed you, fast and full, when the fridge was empty and the pantry echoed. Canned sardines on crackers weren't a delicacy. They were a defense against going to bed hungry. And for a lot of folks, that was more than enough. Onion soup with croutons and broth. You took 3 onions, not because you wanted to, but because that's all you had. You sliced them thin, fried them low and slow in a little butter or oil until they went golden and soft. Then you added broth, real if you had it, bouillon if you didn't. Let it simmer until the house smelled like something worth remembering. Meanwhile, you toasted old bread, cubed it rough, and dropped it into bowls. The soup got ladled over the top, the bread soaking in until it barely held together. No cheese, no frills, just onions, broth, and the taste of getting by. And for that night, that was enough. Milk toast, bread, and hot milk. There was nothing fancy about milk toast. It was the kind of meal you made when your body needed warmth and your wallet was empty. It started with stale bread, soft white slices that had seen better days. You toasted them lightly if the stove worked, or just tore them into pieces if it didn't. Meanwhile, you warmed a pan of milk, whole if you had it, watered down if you didn't, stirring slow so it wouldn't scorch. A pinch of salt, maybe a dab of butter, or a shake of sugar, depending on what kind of night it had been. Once the milk was hot, you poured it straight over the bread in a bowl, letting it soak in and soften everything until it was more comfort than food. It was quiet, it was plain, and it went down easy. For sick days, end-of-month nights, or just when there wasn't much else to eat, milk toast did the job. It warmed your hands, it calmed your stomach, and it reminded you that sometimes survival didn't look like a feast. It looked like a bowl of hot milk poured over bread, and that was good enough. Lard and salt sandwich. It was a sandwich that didn't whisper luxury. It shouted survival. In the rural stretches of America, especially the South and parts of Appalachia, lard was more than a cooking fat. It was sustenance in a jar. When meat was scarce and butter too expensive, Folks would smear thick layers of pork lard onto stale slices of white bread, sometimes warmed just enough to soften, then sprinkle on salt for taste. The bread was often homemade or store-bought at a discount rack, day-old, maybe mold-trimmed. This sandwich had no fancy name, but for the working poor, it filled bellies and kept the body going for hours of farm work, factory shifts, or walking long distances. Some added cracked black pepper, a dash of vinegar, or a sliver of onion, if the garden allowed it. Kids sometimes brought them to school, wrapped in wax paper or newspaper. It was greasy, heavy, and left a white film on the fingers. But it was calories. It was comfort. And above all, it was cheap. It told the story of a family doing the best they could with the scraps life handed them. And despite its humble ingredients, there was something oddly warming about it. Like the fat itself carried the memory of the hog butchering season, smokehouses, and kinfolk gathered around a wood stove in winter. Fried rice with whatever? Leftovers. Fried rice was never planned. It was built from what got left behind. Cold rice, scraps of meat, half an onion, a spoonful of peas hiding in the back of the freezer. You dumped it all into a hot skillet slicked with bacon, grease, oil, or whatever fat you had. Fried it fast, stirred it hard, scraped the bottom to catch all the crispy bits. If you had an egg, you scrambled it in. If you didn't, you added more rice. Soy sauce was a blessing. Salt and pepper were the usual stand-ins. It didn't matter what went in. The result was always the same. Hot, savory, full of flavor and heat. A spoonful of fried rice filled more than your belly. It filled the gap between not knowing what to cook and making something that felt like real food. And when it was gone, you were full. That was all it had to be. Dried beef gravy over rice. Dried beef gravy over rice wasn't just dinner. It was an invention born out of bare pantries and tighter wallets. You started with a tiny jar of dried beef, salty and stiff, torn into shreds or rough slices because nobody wasted time with neatness when they were this hungry. You dropped it into a hot pan with a lump of lard, bacon grease, or butter, whatever was closest to hand. The beef crackled for a moment, waking up in the fat, before you stirred in a big spoonful of flour and cooked it into a dark roux. Then came the milk, poured slow, stirred hard, scraping up every scrap from the pan bottom. The gravy thickened quick, going from pale to heavy, the beef softening inside it, surrendering its salt and smoke into the sauce. Meanwhile, a pot of rice boiled on the back burner, each grain puffing up, white and forgiving. You ladled that thick, salty gravy over a mound of rice so big it barely fit on the plate. It wasn't delicate. It was a survival disguised as something rich. You didn't think about tomorrow's meals while eating it. You just kept spooning it into your mouth until the hollow feeling was finally gone. Hominy and salt. Hominy wasn't glamorous. It didn't dress up the plate. It didn't even pretend to be exciting. But it stuck to your ribs, and in a world where food had to work as hard as you did, that was all anyone asked for. You cracked open a big can or boiled dried hominy if you were lucky enough to have the patience. You dumped it into a pot, salted it heavy, and simmered it until the kernels swelled soft and fragrant. Some nights you fried it crisp in bacon grease. Other nights you just ate it as it came, a big steaming bowl of chewy, salty corn. No butter, no pepper, just heat, salt, and stubbornness. It didn't taste like much, but it filled you. It coated your stomach in warmth and starch and got you through the nights when the wind howled too hard and the workday stretched too long. Hominy and salt wasn't a meal you bragged about. It was a meal you remembered because it showed up when nothing else did and when every bite mattered more than anything else in the world. Sweetened condensed milk sandwiches. There were times when there wasn't meat, cheese, or even peanut butter left in the house. But there might be a dusty can of sweetened condensed milk tucked away in the pantry. And if there was, you had yourself dinner. You sliced open 2 pieces of white bread, soft if you were lucky, stale if you weren't, and poured thick, slow ribbons of condensed milk right across the middle. The milk pooled, heavy, glistening, sticky enough to glue the bread together without even trying. You folded the bread closed and bit down fast before it all ran down your wrists. The milk was sweet beyond sweet, dense with sugar and fat, coating your tongue and hitting your stomach like a stone wrapped in velvet. Some folks drizzled extra sugar over the top. Others dusted it with cinnamon or nutmeg if there was anything fancy left in the spice cabinet. But it didn't need it. Sweetened condensed milk sandwiches weren't meals you served with pride. They were meals you served because sugar was calories, and calories were survival. And for a few sticky, glorious minutes, they made the world seem a little softer. Ketchup sandwiches. You didn't eat a ketchup sandwich because you loved it. You ate it because the fridge was empty and ketchup was still there. Spread across soft bread, or stiff bread, if that's all you had, it gave sweetness, tang, and color to an otherwise blank meal. You folded it over and ate it fast, maybe with a little shame, maybe with a quiet laugh. It filled you, barely, but sometimes barely was enough. Ketchup sandwiches were desperation wrapped in softness. A last resort that still showed up when everything else was gone. Cold spaghetti sandwich. Back then, leftovers didn't sit quietly in Tupperware waiting to be forgotten. They got slapped between slices of bread and became tomorrow's lunch. Cold spaghetti, sauce and all, was no exception. You'd take yesterday's noodles, stiff and tangled into little matted clumps, and lay them out across white sandwich bread like some kind of red-smeared haystack. Maybe a shake of Parmesan dusted over the top if you were lucky, or a slice of American cheese to bind it together. Most of the time, though, it was just cold pasta, tomato sauce, and bread. Kids brought it to school wrapped in wax paper. Factory workers ate it in the cab of a truck. It was messy, sure, sauce squeezing out the sides, staining fingers and lunch bags. But it was filling, and it was normal. Nobody flinched. Today it might seem like a joke, the kind of thing you'd see on a food challenge show. But for people living through layoffs, strikes, and months with more bills than paychecks, cold spaghetti sandwiches were just what you did. No shame, no waste, just leftovers turned into fuel. Boiled eggs and toast. You boiled the eggs hard. No soft yolks, no fancy techniques. Just a rolling pot of water and a handful of eggs, cooked until they were solid through. You peeled them at the table, steam rising from your fingertips. Slice them, or mash them right onto toasted bread, maybe with a dab of mustard or a shake of salt if the day had gone well. Sometimes there was butter. Most times just dry toast and the egg to carry it. It was quiet food, the kind you ate with your head down, not because you were ashamed, but because you were too tired to talk. Boiled eggs and toast didn't fill the house with the smell of dinner. It didn't need to. It just filled the body and gave you enough to get through the rest of the night. Simple, soft, and steady. That was the power in it. Flour dumplings in tomato juice. When the meat ran out, but the hunger didn't, flour dumplings in tomato juice filled the gap. It started with a pot of cheap tomato juice, poured straight from the can into a dented saucepan, thinned with a little water if you needed to stretch it. You brought the juice to a simmer, bubbling slow, smelling sharp and sour in the warm kitchen. Then came the dumplings, nothing but flour, salt, and a splash of water, stirred into a thick, heavy dough you could scoop up by the spoonful. You dropped rough lumps of dough straight into the boiling tomato broth. They floated up fat and lumpy, soaking in the juice, steaming in the heat. Some folks seasoned the broth with a little black pepper. Some added a dab of bacon grease or a crumbled bouillon cube, if they had one. Most just let it be, simple and sharp, the dumplings soft and chewy against the tangy broth. It wasn't a meal built for joy. It was a meal built to survive. Heavy dumplings, thin broth, and a little heat, enough to trick a growling stomach into silence for one more night. Cold rice with syrup or molasses. There were nights when there wasn't time or energy to cook again. You opened the icebox and pulled out the cold pot of leftover rice, stuck together in clumps, but still good enough. You scooped it into bowls with a big metal spoon, the grains sticking together in cool, chewy mounds. Then you drizzled syrup, cheap corn syrup if you had it, molasses if you were blessed, over the top, letting it sink down into the cracks like rain into dry earth. You stirred just enough to coat it, breaking up the clumps until the rice glistened brown and sticky. Some added a sprinkle of sugar or cinnamon if there was a jar left half full in the cabinet. Most just ate it as it was, cold, sweet, heavy. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't hot. But it was food. And when you were so tired that even lighting the stove felt impossible, it was a quiet salvation. Cold rice with syrup wasn't about flavor fireworks. It was about using every scrap, eating until you were full, and reminding yourself that tomorrow, somehow, would come anyway. Cabbage roll, casserole, lazy man's version. Cabbage rolls were beautiful. Cabbage roll, casserole, was practical. You didn't have time to roll leaves and tie them up nice. You had 5 kids, 1 oven, and no meat to waste. You browned a little beef, or none at all, mixed it with cooked rice, onions, and canned tomato sauce. Chopped cabbage got layered in a baking dish, then the rice mixture, then more cabbage and more sauce. You baked it covered until the cabbage went soft and the rice soaked up all the tangy, smoky juice. It came out messy, bubbling, fork tender, and full of soul. You didn't care how it looked. It tasted like something much fancier. Lazy Man's cabbage roll casserole wasn't lazy. It was survival with a little creative license. And when it hit the table, nobody questioned how much effort went into it. They just ate, and that was enough. Buttered noodles with black pepper. When money got tight and the day was long, buttered noodles with pepper was the meal that answered back. Boil pasta, any kind. Drain it, drop in a stick of butter, or however much was left, and stir until every noodle was coated and shiny. Then hit it with the black pepper. A lot of black pepper. No cheese, no sauce. Just butter, heat, and pepper, sharp enough to make your mouth pay attention. Served in a bowl, eaten with a spoon, and maybe chased with a piece of bread, it didn't pretend to be anything but what it was. Simple, fast, and filling. Exactly what you needed at the end of the kind of day you didn't want to talk about. Dried apple and rice bake. This was a pantry dish, built from things that didn't go bad, even when everything else did. You boiled rice until tender, then folded in a handful of dried apples, chopped rough, a little sugar, a bit of cinnamon, and a spoonful of lard or butter turned it into something that almost felt like dessert. You poured it into a baking dish, baked it until the top set and the apples softened, then spooned it into bowls while it was still warm. It wasn't a flashy meal. It was quiet, simple, and sweet in a way that stuck with you. Dried apple and rice bake was what you made when you wanted comfort, but the store was too far, and the money was too short. And when you sat down to eat it, spoon in hand, it tasted like home. Hardtack and butter. Hardtack wasn't food you made because you wanted to. It was food you made because you had no other choice. A brick of flour, water, and salt baked until it was dry enough to survive a war. Hardtack lived longer than the people who made it. When there wasn't meat, when there wasn't soup, and when there wasn't even a can of beans left in the pantry, you reached for hardtack. You cracked it open if you were strong enough, softened it in coffee or milk if you weren't, and spread butter, real, rancid, or substitute, over the jagged top to make it something almost edible. The butter soaked into the cracks, softened the chew a little, and gave it a richness that your tongue craved after too many lean meals. Sometimes you dipped it into hot broth to make it manageable. Other times you ate it as it was, dry and dense, grinding it down with tired teeth. Hardtack and butter wasn't dinner for those who wanted luxury. It was dinner for those who understood that a full stomach, even one filled with a meal older than the clothes on your back, was still a blessing worth fighting for. Macaroni and tomatoes. There was nothing glamorous about boiled macaroni dumped into a skillet full of canned tomatoes. But when you were broke, it tasted like pure genius. The macaroni soaked up the sharp, sweet tang of the tomatoes, stretching a 50-cent can and a handful of dry noodles into a meal that could feed 3 kids and still have a little left over for tomorrow. Salt, pepper, maybe a knob of butter if you were lucky. That was it. No fancy herbs, no Parmesan showers, just tomatoey, slippery noodles on a chipped plate, steaming in the kitchen, while the radio played something soft in the background. Banana and mayonnaise sandwich. In the rural South, it was practically a rite of passage. A ripe banana sliced lengthwise, laid on a thick smear of mayonnaise, and closed inside soft white bread. It sounds like a crime against nature today, but back then it was Saturday lunch, or something a grandmother made with a smile and a wink. The sweetness of the banana met the tang of the mayo, and somehow it worked. Or at least, people told themselves it did. This sandwich was born in kitchens where fruit was rare, and you didn't let anything go brown on the counter. Bananas were a treat, but if you had one, and not much else, mayo and bread made it a meal. It was soft, it was sticky, and it was shockingly filling. Some folks added peanut butter to bridge the gap between sweet and savory. Others swore it needed to be eaten with a glass of milk to wash down the confusion. These days, even mentioning it gets scrunched noses and fake gags. But ask someone who grew up on it, and you'll hear stories, not just about the taste, but about summer days, warm kitchens, and the strange alchemy of poverty and comfort. Mashed potato pancakes. Leftover mashed potatoes weren't thrown out, they were transformed. Mashed potato pancakes were second-day salvation, a meal built from scraps that tasted better than most things made fresh. You started with cold, stiff mashed potatoes, lumpy, buttery, maybe a little dry. Stir in an egg if you had one, a spoonful of flour, and a pinch of salt. Some folks added chopped onions. Others tossed in a handful of cheese or herbs when they were lucky. You formed the mixture into thick, heavy patties and laid them into a hot, greased skillet. The outside crisped up golden and crackly, while the inside stayed soft and creamy. The smell alone was enough to pull kids to the kitchen like a dinner bell. No need for sides, just a stack of hot cakes, maybe a dab of sour cream or a shake of pepper on top. They were cheap, filling, and made from nothing new. But when your fork cracked through that crust into the steaming middle, it didn't feel like leftovers. It felt like a quiet little miracle. Cabbage fritters. Cabbage fritters weren't fancy. They were desperation, fried up, golden and crisp. You started with what you had. A withering head of cabbage, some flour, a few tablespoons of bacon grease, maybe one egg if you could spare it. You shredded the cabbage fine, stirred it into a loose, sticky batter, and dropped fat spoonfuls onto a hot skillet. They sputtered in the grease, smelling sharp and green and alive. You flattened them with the back of your spoon, pressing them hard into the pan so they crisped at the edges. No fancy sauces, no careful plating, just a plate stacked with hot fritters, greasy at the edges, heavy enough to keep a man moving through a winter shift. If there was vinegar, you splashed it over the top. If not, you ate them plain, hot, rough, and good enough to make the house smell like there was something worth sitting down for. Cabbage fritters didn't cost much, but they gave you the sense, for a few minutes, that you were still doing all right, still making dinner happen, still finding a way. Creamed corn sandwich. There was a time when canned creamed corn was everywhere, on tables, in casseroles, poured over biscuits. But one of its lesser-known roles was between bread. 2 slices of white sandwich bread, usually untoasted, soaked up a generous spoonful of cold or room-temperature creamed corn. It oozed out the sides, slippery and bright yellow. The bread went soggy fast, so you had to eat it quick, no dawdling. This wasn't a sandwich made for presentation. It was born from a single can, meant to feed 6 people, spread thin across whatever starch was available. If the corn was warm, it felt like comfort. If it was cold, it was necessity. School kids ate it at lunchtime. Working men ate it while walking to the bus stop. Sometimes it was paired with a slice of tomato or a thin sheet of onion, but even plain, it served its purpose. Fill the belly, don't break the bank. Nowadays, the thought of a corn sandwich might make someone queasy. But then again, most people today haven't stood in front of a cabinet with only 1 can and a loaf of bread and had to make it work. Fried salt pork with grits. Salt pork was never the main event. It was the seasoning, the edge, the crackle. But if you had a thick slice and some grits to go with it, you had dinner. You sliced the salt pork into thick slabs, tossed them in a hot skillet, and waited until they blistered and curled. The fat rendered out, filling the pan with flavor. While that sizzled, grits simmered on the back burner, slow cooked, salted just enough, and stirred until they were smooth as cream. When the pork was done, you poured the hot fat into the grits, stirred once, and plated the meat right on top. It was salty, rich, and hot. Grits soaked up every drop, and the pork added just enough chew to remind you there was meat involved. No one left hungry? Not that night. Bologna boats with melted cheese. If you were hungry and broke, and had 5 minutes to get dinner on the table, bologna boats had your back. You started with thick-cut slices of bologna, the cheaper, the better, laid flat on a baking sheet. Once they hit the heat, the edges curled up into little bowls, perfect for holding whatever scraps you had. Most nights it was just a scoop of shredded cheese, cheddar, American, or even broken up slices from a crumpled wrapper. You dropped it right in the middle and let it melt until it bubbled and browned, the fat from the bologna sizzling into the tray. If you had crushed crackers, leftover mashed potatoes, or a dollop of mustard, those went in too. But even plain, the smell was enough to bring the whole house to the kitchen. Served with a spoonful of slaw, canned green beans, or nothing at all, bologna boats didn't apologize for what they were. They were salty, greasy, and full of character. Dinner on a dime, comfort without credentials. And when you took that first bite, crunchy edges and molten center, you didn't care how much money you didn't have. It just tasted good. Lard biscuits with sorghum syrup. Biscuits didn't need butter to be good. They didn't need buttermilk, fancy flour, or anything from a store shelf marked luxury. They needed flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and a good hard dollop of cold lard, cut in with fingertips that knew the work of real kitchens. You mixed the dough by hand, rolled it rough, and cut it into thick, squat rounds that hit the oven like promises you had to keep. They baked up craggy and hot, smelling like every good thing you still had left. When they came out, you split them open with your hands, no knife needed, and spooned sorghum syrup into the steamy middle. The syrup oozed into every crack, soaked through the crumb, and sweetened the air with the smell of warm sugar and hot bread. Lard biscuits with sorghum syrup were sticky, messy, and heavy enough to carry you through 2 chores and a skipped lunch. They weren't about celebrating. They were about surviving, with a little sweetness in the hard times. And sometimes that was enough to lift a tired family 1 more mile down the road. Cornmeal dumplings in broth. When the cupboard was nearly bare and soup alone wasn't enough, cornmeal dumplings turned thin broth into something that could hold you over. You brought water or stock to a boil, sometimes with scraps of onion, maybe a bone, or bit of meat from a previous meal. Into that went the dumplings, cornmeal stirred with salt, a little lard or bacon grease, and just enough water to hold together. You dropped spoonfuls of the thick batter right into the bubbling liquid. They swelled up slow, soaking in the flavor and turning soft in the middle, firm at the edges. It was humble food, built to stretch, the kind of meal that didn't fill your plate, but filled your belly. Cornmeal dumplings weren't about flavor fireworks. They were about survival, patience, and the quiet kind of resourcefulness passed down from someone who never once wasted a bite. Bread and lard with salt. There was nothing fancier than the way you learned to survive. Bread and lard with salt was survival dressed in simplicity. A thick slice of bread, stale or fresh, it didn't matter, slathered with a cold smear of lard from the tin in the icebox. Not butter, not margarine, just fat. You sprinkled a few grains of salt across the top, ate it slow, ate it fast. Ate it because that was what there was. There wasn't a recipe. There wasn't a debate. It was a meal born of hardship and hardened hands, the kind that didn't ask for flavor as much as it asked for calories. And when it went down, it reminded you, full is full. Burnt toast with milk. Sometimes meals didn't start with fresh bread. They started with whatever bread had been left too close to the flame or forgotten on the rack until it blackened and cracked. Burnt toast wasn't something you threw out. It was something you revived with hot milk and stubbornness. You scorched the bread hard, sometimes on purpose, sometimes because there was no one standing at the stove. Then you broke it into pieces and dropped it into a battered bowl. You heated milk on the stove, scalded it just shy of boiling, and poured it over the crumbled, blackened bread. The milk softened the crust, took the bite out of the burnt edges, and turned what would have been waste into something warm enough to quiet an empty stomach. Sometimes you added a spoonful of sugar or a pinch of salt if there was any left. Most of the time, it was just milk, bread, and steam curling up into your face. Burnt toast with milk wasn't comfort food in the way people talk about today. It was survival food, a way of refusing to waste anything and finding a little heat in a cold house when there wasn't much else to hope for. Rice and red beans. Rice and red beans was the meal that stretched for miles. 1 pot, 2 ingredients, and time. That was all it needed. The beans soaked overnight, softening up for the long boil ahead. Come morning, you'd throw them into a heavy pot with a ham bone, salt pork, or nothing at all if meat was short. Simmered slow, the beans turned creamy and thick. By sundown, They clung to the spoon and carried the scent of something far more expensive than what actually went into the pot. The rice was cheap and dependable, boiled plain and ready to soak up all the flavor. Poured over a pile, the beans made a whole meal out of very little. Some folks added hot sauce, others just spooned it in and leaned back full. Rice and red beans didn't make a scene. It just showed up hot, heavy, and right on time. Rice and red beans. Rice and red beans was the meal that stretched for miles. One pot, two ingredients, and time. That was all it needed. The beans soaked overnight, softening up for the long boil ahead. Come morning, you'd throw them into a heavy pot with a ham bone, salt pork, or nothing at all if meat was short. Simmered slow, the beans turned creamy and thick. By sundown, they clung to the spoon and carried the scent of something far more expensive than what actually went into the pot. The rice was cheap and dependable, boiled plain and ready to soak up all the flavor. Poured over a pile, the beans made a whole meal out of very little. Some folks added hot sauce, others just spooned it in and leaned back full. Rice and red beans didn't make a scene. It just showed up hot, heavy, and right on time. Mustard sandwiches. 2 slices of bread, a smear of mustard. That was it. But when that was all there was, it was enough. You spread it thick, yellow and sharp, over whatever bread you had, fresh, stale, or halfway to toast. Folded it over, or ate it open-faced, maybe with a shake of salt if you needed more flavor. There was no protein, no side dish, just bite after bite of tang and chew. Mustard sandwiches weren't meals you planned. They were meals that happened when payday didn't. And somehow they carried you to the next one. It wasn't about taste. It was about not giving up. Potato cakes with onion. It started with leftovers, the kind nobody really wanted until you gave them a second life. Cold, mashed potatoes, stiff from the fridge, got dumped into a bowl and mixed with chopped onion, a little flour, maybe an egg if you could spare one. You shaped the mixture into heavy patties and dropped them into a hot skillet, greased with whatever fat was left. The outside crisped golden brown, forming a crust that cracked when your fork hit it. Inside, the potatoes turned creamy again, the onions soft and sweet. You didn't need toppings. No ketchup, no sour cream. Just a stack of hot cakes on a plate and the steam rising to meet you. Some nights they were breakfast. Some nights dinner. Sometimes both. They didn't last long on the table, and they didn't need help to taste like comfort. Potato cakes with onion reminded you that even the things people thought were done, cold, unwanted, forgotten, could come back better than before. All they needed was a little heat and someone willing to try. Mayonnaise sandwich. It was desperation in its purest form. When the fridge was almost empty and the pantry had been picked clean, the mayonnaise jar was the last soldier standing. A mayonnaise sandwich wasn't dressed up. It didn't pretend. It was 2 slices of plain bread, often drying out at the edges, spread with a slippery pale layer of mayo. Some added black pepper for a hint of life. Others toasted the bread to give it crunch. But the core of it was the same: fat, blandness, and the soft squish of emptiness. Kids often ate it after school while waiting for dinner that might never come. It was a lunchbox filler and a midnight snack when paychecks were still days away. It left the mouth coated and the conscience quiet, because it meant no one was starving, not tonight. And somehow the tang of mayonnaise lingered like a ghost in the kitchen, reminding everyone of the line between getting by and going under. People laughed about it later in life. But in the moment, there was nothing funny. It was a sandwich that meant survival, and survival was sometimes the only victory a family could claim. Canned tamale pie. It came out of a box, a can, or a desperate idea, and sometimes all three. Canned tamale pie was the last-minute hero of dinner tables that had more mouths than money. You browned what little ground beef you had, stirred in a can of corn, a can of tomatoes or chili beans, and maybe a dash of cumin or chili powder if the spice rack wasn't empty. That mixture went into a baking dish, bubbling and loud. Then came the topping, boxed cornbread mix, poured right over the top, thick enough to seal it in and fluffy enough to make it feel special. Baked until golden on top and steaming at the edges, tamale pie sliced like a casserole and ate like a hot meal should, fast, easy, and filling. No one asked what kind of meat was in it. No one complained it wasn't real tamales. They just ate it, smiled, and came back for seconds. Pork neck bones with rice and gravy. They weren't the prettiest cut in the butcher case. Bony, fatty, and full of work. But pork neck bones carried flavor, like nothing else. You browned them hard in a hot pot, fat popping and spitting, then added water or broth and let them simmer slow. The meat clung tight to the bone at first, but after a couple of hours it softened, falling away in rich, tender bites. While the bones worked their magic, you stirred up a pot of white rice and let it sit covered, steam, making each grain puff perfect. The gravy was the prize, thickened with flour or just reduced down to a silky, smoky sauce. It got poured heavy over the rice and scattered with bits of meat. No fancy presentation, no cutting required, just spoon after spoon of salty, rich, soul-warming food. Pork neck bones with rice and gravy didn't ask for praise. It just did its job, one bowl at a time. Butter and lettuce sandwich. Simple, humble, cold. The butter and lettuce sandwich was less a meal and more a memory of gardens that grew wild and fridges that hummed half empty. Fresh, limp lettuce leaves, often iceberg or romaine, laid over a layer of salted butter on plain bread. No protein, no dressing, no frills. It was the sandwich you made when all the meat was gone, the kids were hungry, and the garden was generous enough to offer something green. The butter gave it richness, the lettuce gave it crunch. It was eaten by coal miners' daughters, dust bowl mothers, and millions of children who learned early what it meant to make do. Some toasted the bread, others didn't bother. Some added a slice of tomato if the harvest was kind, but mostly it was butter, lettuce, and hope layered quietly in a kitchen where the radio murmured about war, work, or wheat prices. It was the kind of sandwich that reminded you food wasn't always about pleasure. Sometimes it was about continuity, the ritual of lunch, the semblance of normalcy. And in that, it offered comfort, brown sugar, and butter bread. When money ran out but the need for something sweet didn't, brown sugar and butter bread showed up. It was cheap, fast, and good enough to make the youngest kids smile and the oldest Wests to remember better times. You took a slice of bread, fresh if you had it, stale if you didn't care, and spread it thick with butter, or margarine if real butter was a dream that week. Then you grabbed a handful of brown sugar and sprinkled it heavy over the top, letting it soak into the butter until it turned glossy and wet. Sometimes you toasted it, sometimes you just ate it straight, the sugar crunching between your teeth, the butter slick and salty against the back of your throat. It wasn't complicated, it wasn't healthy, it wasn't a meal you wrote letters about, but it was sweet. It filled the gap between dinner and bedtime when the real desserts cost too much or didn't exist at all. Brown sugar and butter bread was poor man's candy, Depression-era cake and a 5-minute reminder that comfort didn't need to come wrapped in a box or bought from a store. It could come from what you already had, and that was enough. Tuna noodle casserole, heavy on noodles. It was never about the tuna. It was about making one can of fish stretch over a whole pan of noodles and come out tasting like something someone might call a casserole. You boiled egg noodles, drained them, and stirred in canned cream of mushroom soup, a splash of milk, and one lone can of tuna, drained and flaked to disappear evenly through the mix. Some folks added peas or shredded cheese if they had it. Most didn't. Everything got dumped into a baking dish and topped with crushed crackers, breadcrumbs, or whatever could add a bit of crunch. Baked until golden, tuna noodle casserole wasn't flashy, but it was warm, soft, and predictable. 3 things you clung to when the world outside the oven wasn't. Grits with bacon. Drippings. Grits were the great equalizer. Rich or poor, north or south, if you had a bag of cornmeal and some hot water, you had a meal. But when money got tight and meat disappeared from the table, bacon drippings turned grits into something sacred. You stirred them slow over a low flame, watching the grains swell and thicken into a creamy, soft mound. Then came the real trick, taking a spoonful of saved bacon fat from an old tin by the stove and stirring it in until the whole pot shimmered with flavor. Salted just right, the grits didn't need anything else. But if you had a little shredded cheese, a fried egg, or a bit of leftover meat to throw on top, it became something that felt like a feast, served in chipped bowls or poured into plates and eaten with crusty bread, grits with bacon. Drippings weren't about filling time. They were about filling space. Real food, born from almost nothing, that hugged your ribs and stuck with you all day.